Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the most interesting aspects, besides the doctrine of the mean, in Aristotle's virtue ethics, as we find it in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, is his specific discussion of these various virtues, separating them out and talking about them in relation to their subject matter. He's spoken in outline earlier and then says, well, we need to get down to the kathekasta in Greek, down to the specifics about these. How many different virtues can we distinguish? One of the things that I want to signal, which falls outside of the bounds of this text, but it's some very important context, is that Aristotle is not writing in a vacuum. The Greeks had acknowledged a number of virtues beforehand and talked about them quite a bit. Plato, Aristotle's predecessor, very famously distinguished the four cardinal virtues, the virtues that we end up calling cardinal virtues because they're assumed to be most important. A classification that not only the Platonists would use, but also the Stoics. Plato also has some of his characters in his dialogues speak of 5 virtues, which are the cardinal virtues plus the virtue of piety, as you can find it, for example, in the Protagoras. Now, what are the cardinal virtues? They are justice, prudence, or wisdom, practical wisdom, courage, and temperance. You notice that Aristotle is not going to talk very much about justice until much later in Book 5. He's going to treat it as a separate topic. It is one of the virtues. It's actually one of the most important of the virtues, but he's not going to discuss it very much in his listing in Book 2 of the virtues. He's also going to push prudence, or practical wisdom, off into what are called the intellectual virtues, and here we're discussing the moral virtues. So the two that he is inheriting, you might say, from Plato and discussing right at the start are going to be courage and temperance. He discusses these first in this listing in Book 2, and then later on in Book 3 when he begins discussing the virtues in more depth and detail. Those will be the first 2 that he's going to address. Now notice that I've got them arranged under a couple different headings. We're not going to worry about others anymore, but we're very interested in how does Aristotle lay these out. And that gives you a bit of a clue into why there are so many virtues for Aristotle. He thinks that it's important to differentiate the virtues based on what they are actually about. So all of the virtues actually do have to do with feelings and with actions, but there's some that have to do even more, you might say, with feelings or emotions, pathe, and the actions which then we respond to those emotions with. So with courage, there's actually 2 different feelings, the feeling of fear and the feeling of confidence, which is not the same thing as courage. It's like raw material that courage works on. And with any of these, we have a mean state, right? The virtuous mean, like I put here. Feeling fear to the right extent at the right time for the right reason, and not feeling fear at other times. Likewise, feeling confidence to the degree that one ought to, and then responding appropriately in action. That's what courage is, so that falls under this category. Temperance. Temperance has to do with the bodily appetites or desires. So the ones that Aristotle consistently comes back to over and over again are food, taste, both in the sense of like filling us up and in the sense of the good taste. Drinking, particularly wine, but we could extend that to any sort of intoxicating substance. And sexuality, which covers a lot of ground. We might add to that some other bodily desires as well. But that desire for them, and the desire not to feel bodily pains, is what temperance governs. Good temper, or mildness, has to do with our response of anger. One of the very basic human emotions, one that plays an important role in not only ethics, but also in the way society works. Just think about how much of a role anger plays in politics, in how people post things online. If you want to get something viral, best way to do it is appeal to anger, as the research turns out. So those are three different virtues, and notice they have to do with different affective domains, right? Fear and confidence, anger, desire, these really basic things. These are the subject matter for a whole class of virtues. Now, he moves on and starts talking about virtues that have to do with what we can call external goods. That is, goods that are not goods of the body or goods of the soul, but have to do with, say, property, or wealth, or honor, or offices. And we can actually draw a dividing line between the two which have to do with how you dispose of your wealth, and the two which have to do with honor, with recognition or respect, right? So liberality or generosity has to do with how on a day-to-day basis you interact with people in terms of not just your feelings and actions, but the external goods that you have. How do you spend your money? How do you dispose of the goods that you possess? Do you hold on to them very tightly like a miser? Are you too spendthrift with them, sort of indiscriminately sending them out to the universe, as some people might say? Well, or do you pursue the virtuous mean of giving to the right people for the right reasons at the right time? All of that sort of qualifications. Magnificence, this is very, very interesting. Aristotle thinks that not only is there sort of a small-scale virtue that anybody can practice, there's also a large-scale virtue that is concerned with, we might say, public works, with liberality or generosity writ large within the fabric of society. One that he doesn't think everybody can actually cultivate because it takes certain resources in order to do that. Magnanimity, or better said, since I always trip over that word, great-souledness, which is what it means, that has to do with honor. And the magnanimous person, or the great-souled person, is actually one of the ideals for Aristotle. We'll talk at the end of this about the unity of the virtues very quickly, but that is something on a high level as well. The great-souled person is not very common. The opposite vices would be somebody who doesn't seek out enough honor for himself, or the more common person who seeks out too much honor without really deserving it. Right ambition is kind of a lower level version of the same thing, sort of like it has the same relation to great-souledness as liberality has to magnificence. Aristotle thinks that these are important to cultivate within a person, that these don't just amount to parts of justice, or these other virtues, that these are distinctive. He goes on further. This becomes even more interesting, and he says that there are certain virtues that have to do with behavior and feelings and how we use these or regulate these in terms of social life, in terms of life with other people, our amusements, our day-to-day life with them. One of these he calls truthfulness, and by this he doesn't just mean telling the truth in general. A lot of that would fall under justice for him. He means telling the truth about oneself in what you say and how you behave. And I would be willing to go so far as to say, for us, how we consume, what our spending habits are. Do you say what you really are, or are you pretending to be something different? Pretending to be better, pretending to be worse. That's an interesting virtue right there. Irreducible to these other ones. Good humor. Aristotle is one of the few people among virtue ethicists who actually highlights the fact that having a sense of humor is something good, and it is part of a full human life. We ought to have pleasantries and enjoyments and joking around. That is part of a full life for Aristotle. We don't want to go too far with it and be, the way some comics are, who are not nice people to hang around with. Some are, though, I can say. Finally, we have friendliness. This is also a virtue. Friendship is something that Aristotle will be talking about as something a bit different, but friendliness is a virtuous state that has to do with how you interact with other people. Aristotle thinks that these virtues of social life, these virtues of how we deal with external goods, they are distinct domains of our existence, and we need to take them seriously if we want to cultivate human excellence. Now, I mentioned that I would say a little bit about the unity of the virtues at the end. Aristotle seems to suggest at certain points that there might be three candidates for what would count as the unifying virtue that would encompass the rest. Prudence is, he says, required for the virtues, and we'll talk about that in another video. Justice, he talks about in its complete sense as being all the virtues practiced in relation to another. And magnanimity or great-souledness also is a candidate for having all the virtues, at least in the sense that the great-souled person would be great-souled by having all the virtues. But all of them are distinct from each other, and Aristotle thinks it's important to focus on each one individually as well as to try to cultivate them all together.